Bryant is here. Curry. Darby is here. Fisher's online. Hamilton's online. Hellman. Ashley. Both of the no's are online. Chase is here in red. Rollins. Saunders. Hamlin is here in red. And Vargas. Don't miss anybody. All right. Before I start with announcements, I guess we'll start with attendance words. Yes, the first word for attendance will be human. If you're watching the video, send a sentence that includes the word human. Anyway, for announcements, office hours will be cut an hour short today because I have a meeting, a department meeting at 10. And after that, I will be celebrating Marine Corps birthday. Tomorrow, we'll celebrate Veterans Day. And Sunday, I will be recovering. So if you need me, between now and 10, it's time to reach me because after that, I'll be off the radar. What else? You can now retake exam 3. I've opened that back up to you. This is a regular old retake where it's not timed, it's open book, and you can take it as many times as you want. Only catch is you have to be done with it by the time you go on fall break. And as usual, you get to tell me when you're done. Because like I said, you can take it as many times as you want. So once you're done and ready for me to change your grade, then I'll average your first grade of your last grade. Any questions about that? All right, next week's lab is another virtual lab, but it's not one where you're watching the video. So next week I do plan to be here for lab. With that being said, since it is a virtual lab, as usual, if you get it done before, and then I get it graded before we have lab next week, then you don't need to come in. Any questions about that? Okay, then let's jump into this. So last thing we started talking about population growth models. The last thing I mentioned was what population is. I'm sure you know it's common sense, like what causes population size to change, right? You either have individuals coming in through birth or migrating in, or you can have individuals leaving through death or migrating out, right? Pretty simple. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is this. We talk about growth models. Now, I'm going to explain these two different types of growth models, and you're going to need to know the difference between the two of them for the exam. I'll probably give you an example of one, or give you some hypothetical example, and you need to recognize it as being exponential growth or logistic growth. So let's talk about it. Exponential population growth. This is the expansion in an ideal and unlimited environment. So think about, like, I don't know if you had bacteria on a petri dish, right? That's meant for bacterial growth. At first, that's going to be exponential growth, right? That it is an ideal environment. What I don't like about this definition is technically nothing's unlimited, right? We live on Earth, so we have a finite amount of resources. But things can be relatively unlimited. Anyway, so that's the first thing you need to know about population growth, right? It's an ideal and unlimited environment. Exponential growth is also when the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents basically the growth rate. So if you've had Bio 108 with me, you're very aware of what the growth rate is. So this, for example, is where we humans are. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. It's not exactly where we are, but you can almost think of it like this. Because our population is doing this right here, the second bullet point right here. The population size is multiplied by a constant factor. So say, for example, the human population growth rate is 1.3%. I don't remember what it is. But we have about 8 billion right now, right? So you take 8 billion times 1.3%, basically, right? And then that would give you the next generation. And then once you got that, you would multiply that by 1.3%. I'm not going to ask you to do any math, but the point is, this is what we're talking about, right? When it's exponential, it's just growing and growing and growing by a constant factor. So for another example, if you had rabbits, they had, I don't know, they have 5 babies every time, I guess it depends on the species, right? So you'd have 2 rabbits, right? And then multiply that by 5, right? And you have 10, and then multiply that by 5 because they reproduce, right? And you'd have 50, so on and so forth, right? multiplying it by a constant factor. More importantly, for the exam anyway, the accelerating growth produces what's called a J-shaped curve. So there literally will be a question that says, which one of these produces the J-shaped curve? The answer is exponential growth. It'll make sense on this next slide that I show you a picture of a J-shaped curve. Actually, I'll just draw two of them before I show you a picture. So, the y-axis and x-axis. All right, so that's a J-shaped curve, right? It's kind of got a J to it. Likewise, you could also have another J-shaped curve. It's really steep, right? So, I know that's really poorly drawn, but I could get a test, give you a test question like this and see if you can answer this. That's population A, that's population B. Let's assume these are all the same numbers on the y-axis. These are all the same numbers on the x-axis. Which one of those populations is growing quicker? Population A or population B? This is something you should know. I'm telling you, you're going to need to know for the exam. Which one of those is growing faster? B. Good, B, right? I know it's horribly drawn, but A, it's growing, but it's kind of slow, right? It took however long that was to reach that point. This one, it took that long to reach the same point, right? So yes, B is growing quicker. You might get a question like that on the exam. That's this bullet point here is what I'm trying to get at, right? The slope shows how rapidly the population is growing. I might also ask you this, or more important, or more accurately, the question on the exam, which will be a hypothetical situation, might include some of this information, right? This is common in certain situations following a disturbance. We'll talk a little bit more about disturbances later. But some examples of populations include fires, which should be disturbances. Fires, floods, hurricanes, droughts, cold snaps, nuclear explosions, whatever they go, mudslides. Whatever the case may be, right? If there's a sudden reduction in population size, then all of a sudden it's like, all right, well, we're back in ground one or ground zero, right? So now the population can explode again at first. So that is exponential population growth. Here's a picture of a graph from the old textbook. And they actually did use rabbits for an example. That's an example. So you can see, how quickly it's the population is growing. Any questions about exponential population growth model? All right, the next is logistic population growth model. So remember, there are basically two of them. So this is the second one. And again, the questions on the exam are usually going to be giving you a hypothetical situation, and you recognize which one it is. So, like I said, when I was talking about exponential population growth model, remember I said that was in an ideal and unlimited environment, which is kind of unrealistic because technically there is no such thing as an unlimited environment. What brings us to this? Most environments are not unlimited. And technically, nothing is unlimited, right? But anyway, because there are something called limiting factors. You need to know what limiting factors are. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you what a limiting factor is, but I'm definitely going to use the word. You're going to need to know what I'm talking about later. So what is a limiting factor? Those are environmental factors that restrict population growth. It controls the number of individuals that can occupy a habitat. Just some examples. There's plenty of carbon dioxide in here, right? So if you're growing a plant and it needs, we know what plants need to grow, right? It needs water, it needs sunlight, it needs carbon dioxide. And it needs some nutrients from the soil, right? Now, it usually has enough carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is usually not a limiting factor for plants. However, depending on their soil, like where they're growing, some of the limiting factors might be they need some nitrogen, right, or phosphorus. This is not enough of it. So if it had, usually that's why when you put fertilizer on a plant, which is usually nitrogen or phosphorus, it grows quicker because that's the thing that was keeping it from growing quicker. That was the limiting factor, was the nitrogen or phosphorus. Another example, which is not a biology example, imagine you had a factory and you made chocolate chip cookies. And you had, like, every day, you had a truck full of eggs come in, a truck full of sugar come in, a truck full of flour comes in every day. But then once a week, you get a box of chocolate chips, right? So in that situation, the chocolate chips are your limiting factor, right? You've got plenty of the other ingredients, you don't have many chocolate chips. So are there any questions about what a limiting factor is? All right, here's the next very important concept. Tab 108, you're familiar with this. Let's see, the next word for attendance would be slide. Normal stuff, send in the words 5 minutes after, within 5 minutes after we're done with the discussion. And of course, if you're online, if you're watching this video later, send in the word slide to use it in the sentence. Anyway, a very important concept, a very important term here is carrying capacity. That is the maximum size that a particular environment can sustain. That's the short version. Basically, that's like the population size. Another way of saying it is that's the largest the population can get, whatever population you're studying. Right? Like, I don't know how many squirrels are on WVSU's campus, but I would assume it's near carrying capacity. I bet if we were to check on it year after year after year, it would probably stay pretty steady because WVSU's campus is probably maxed out with the number of squirrels. If it had too many more squirrels, there wouldn't be enough places to hide from the feral cats. There wouldn't be enough water. There wouldn't be enough food, right? So yes, you definitely need to understand what carrying capacity is. Again, note what it says there on the screen. But also another way of thinking of it is that's the max population size. And that finally brings us to the logistic growth model, right? It's when the growth rate decreases as the population size approaches carrying capacity. So in a way, and your book doesn't really describe it like this, but I think it's a great way to describe it, is you start off almost always, back to the graph here, you almost start off always with that logistic growth pattern, that J-shaped curve, right? But then eventually, because like I said, there is no such thing as an unlimited environment. So eventually you're going to get to that point where the population can't get any larger, right? So the population starts slowing down and then it levels out. That is logistic growth, right? So you start off exponential, but then reality kicks in, so to speak. Any given area can only hold so many of any given population. Of course, for humans, this is what makes it interesting for us. We are still doing exponential growth. We haven't technically hit our carrying capacity. If you've had my Bio 108 class, you know what a big deal this is. We don't technically know what our carrying capacity is. And just so you know, like in nature, I don't know how much your book talks about this, but it isn't as if the population hits that number and says, okay, we should level off now, right? It's not like that. No one in the population of whatever organism, whatever species we're talking about, no one's made that decision to level out. What's happening when you hit carrying capacity is there's death, right? So there's new things being born that they can't survive because of those limiting factors, right? There's not enough food, not enough water, not enough places to hide, not enough places to make a nest, whatever the case may be. And things are dying, right? So that's why it levels off. So obviously, when we get to talk about humans, we don't want to get to that point, right? We want to make the decision, like, why don't we see if we can level off before nature makes us level off? Anyway, here's a picture from your old textbook. I love this picture because, again, we were talking about exponential growth models and logistic growth models. These are all models. This is all how we expect things to happen, but they don't always happen exactly like that. So if you look at this red line represents the model, what is expected to happen, right? And we know this is the carrying capacity, but then those dots actually represent the real data. So this is like the real population size as time goes on. And you can see it doesn't fit exactly on the line. And you can see it does go above carrying capacity sometimes, and then it crashes back below it, right? So in real life situations, the population usually doesn't follow this exact curve, right? Usually it fluctuates all around. Now again, for humans, it's done a pretty good job of following that curve. Anyway, are there any questions about logistic growth patterns, logistic growth model? So again, I'll remind you, it starts off exponential. Then once you get that S-shaped curve, not a J-shape, once you get that S-shaped curve, that's when we're talking about logistic growth model. We'll need to know the difference between the two. All right, no questions. The next slide I'm going to show you compares both of them, right? So again, for the exam, I'm going to give you some hypothetical example. We need to know the difference, which is which. So that's why this next slide would be good. And again, this is not from your textbook. These concepts are, but these pictures aren't. So there we go. There's exponential growth. Those rabbits are going and going and going. And then we got logistic growth, so those seals were going and going and going for a while. But then again, there was limiting factors, whatever it was, places to hide, places to breed, food, whatever it was. So things started dying more, or being birthed less. Things kind of evened out. Of course, what this doesn't show you, again, none of the textbooks really talk about this. When you think about it, that eventually too is going to hit carrying capacity, and eventually that exponential growth will turn into just. Anyway, any questions about that? All right, then let's go back to this idea of factors, right? Like I said, there's limiting factors. So we're going to talk about some of them. And under that one term, limiting factors, there's two subcategories. There's density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. And you're going to need to know the difference between the two of them. Again, for the exam, I'll probably give you some situations, some hypothetical situations. You can recognize it as being density-dependent or density-independent. And then, of course, as I usually do, it's a good time to remind you, it's a multiple choice exam, so those will be the two real logical choices. And then those will be a bunch of nonsense. So please at least don't guess the nonsense. Anyway, let's talk about the first one, density-dependent factors. These are limiting factors whose intensity is related to the population density. Of course, that second bullet point, I don't even need that, right? Of course it can limit the growth of natural populations. So can density-independent factor, that should be in that number. This is not unique to density-dependent. That's the whole idea, right? We're talking about limiting factors, so that second bullet point is a given. But anyway, yes, so the intensity of this factor is related to population density. So, for example, I would say, if there was, COVID-19 is a good example. A lot of people died from that. Some people still are. But that was density dependent because if you're living in New York City, you're around a lot of people, so it's going to be a lot easier for that disease to spread around. Versus if you live in Montana and there's like 100 of you in the whole entire county, and you barely see each other. Does that make sense? So if it's dependent on the population density, it's density dependent. Are there any questions about that? And I'll give you some more examples on the next slide. Before we get there, I'll give you this other word that you need to know. Intra-specific competition. It's going to be another one that you're going to learn. Later we're going to talk about interspecific. The intra-specific is a competition between the same species. Like this picture of those two wolves fighting over whatever it is that they're eating, right? So the key there is intra-specific. It's within the same species. And that would be an example of density dependent, right? So again, you've got these wolves wherever they're living. Let's say they're living in Yellowstone National Park. If you have too many of them, they're going to be competing more and more and more for food. So food would be a good example of a density dependent factor, right? Because the more individuals you have in that same area, the more they're going to be fighting for food. Anyway, some more examples. Accumulation of toxic waste products. More like, maybe think about again, bacteria on a petri dish. They have things they put off and sometimes they're not good for you. Disease transmission under crowded conditions, like I used COVID-19 with humans as an example. Limited food. So again, the more individuals you have in the population in the same area, obviously they're competing for the food, competing for the water, they're competing for places to hide, right? Places to have their nest. We'll point this out too, going back to this first bullet point. Usually when we're talking about dependent or any kind of factors, we usually think of increasing the death rate. It's like, things are dying, right? So if there's limited food, things are going to starve to death. If there's limited water, things are going to die from not having water. So usually it does focus on increased death, but also, yes, lower birth rate, right? Anything that's making the population growth slower. Again, usually that's because there's more deaths, but also it could be because there's lower birth rate. This next slide is a good example of that. This is not from your textbook. We try to explain it to you here. Density of females. Yes, declining reproductive success of song sparrows with increasing population density, right? So This is how many, let's see, mean number of offspring, right? So these birds, they're laying eggs, they hatch, they take care of them, right? What we're seeing here is like when there's very few of them, right? When it's a low density, these birds are having like 4 or 5 babies at a time, right? 4 or 5 eggs at a time. But as the density increases, then they start having fewer babies at a time, right? So again, like I was saying on the last slide, it's not always about death. Sometimes it's about fewer births. Because I would imagine, and I don't know this for sure, but I would imagine once there's a higher density here, that these birds have fewer places to have a good nest, right? So they're probably like, at this point, when there's 70 females per whatever the area is, they're probably running out of places to have a nest. So maybe one of them has to build a nest in some really dumb, stupid place, and it falls over all the time. And every time they try to have babies, they fall down and they don't make it. Right? Because again, in that case, the limiting factor is a place to have a nest. Really quickly, then we can talk about this. Yeah, so again, lowering birth rates is what that one is, and this one's all about increasing death rates. So in this case, again, as the density increases for these birds or these fish, and they live in these kelps, right? They hide in that kelp. That's what keeps them from being eaten. But the more and more you have, the harder it is to hide. So because of that, obviously, as the population increases, or more importantly, the population density increases, they run out of places to hide. Therefore, the death rate increases. Those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about birds or kelp. Well, I don't know. The idea here is, though, if I did ask you that question, you need to recognize this as a density-dependent factor that has either decreased birth rates or increased death rates. Any questions about that? All right, let's talk about density-independent factors, right? So this is kind of like the opposite of the one we just talked about. As you might imagine, density-dependent factors are dependent on the density of the population. Then density-independent factors are where the density is unrelated to the population density, right? So factors include the changes in weather and climate or disturbances. So for example, if, I don't know, if one of those chemical plants over there exploded today and killed every living mammal on campus, we'll go back to the squirrels. It doesn't matter if there's 100 squirrels living on campus or 1,000 squirrels living on campus. If those chemical plants blow up, everything's going to die, right? It doesn't matter how many there are. It could be 1, it could be 1,000. The point is 100% of the squirrels on this campus are going to die from that explosion, regardless of how many there are. Does that make sense? It's not like, or for humans, right? Anyway, any questions about that? All right, this next slide, this is actually out of order. I won't talk about this again. So in the long term, populations are regulated by a complex interaction of density-dependent and density-independent factors, as you can imagine. So you're learning about both of these. Then you're going to be tested on both of them separately. But one thing about it, in reality, they're dealing with both of these things, right? So again, the squirrels on WVSU's campus, they are dealing with that density-dependent factor of having enough food, right? But they're also dealing with the density-independent factors of climate, so on and so forth. Which brings us to this next bullet point, which is population cycles. So again, when we talk about population growth, which is the big thing we're talking about here, we said that there was exponential growth and there was logistic growth, right? I said those are the two types of growth. Well, there's one more that I'm going to teach you about, and it's called a boom and bust cycle. So you need to know what a boom and bust cycle is called. That's it. That's the 3 models that we're talking about. And the common example from almost any textbook you see will be snowshoes and hares. I'll just show you the picture here. It's just an example. I'm not going to specifically ask you questions about this in the exam. But the idea here is there is no logistic growth here. There is no exponential growth. I guess you could argue some of these are exponential when they go up. But these are boom and bust. So what happens is, we'll see what's the red. Okay. Blue one's the lynx, right? No. Blue one's the hare, all right? So as the population grows, right, at first it's an unlimited environment. It's got plenty to eat. right? Population's growing, but eventually maybe because winter hits or because the predator population is also increasing and those things are eating those things, right? So eventually something happens and that population crashes. And of course, the thing that eats them, their population crashes. And the social care, and now it's an unlimited environment again, unlimited. So the population skyrockets again. And as their population skyrockets, again, obviously the lynx does too because they eat them for whatever reason, maybe again, starvation, climate thing, whatever, population crashes again. I'm not going to go through this whole 1850 to whatever year it is. You can see here, right? This is a good example of a boom and bust population growth cycle. So it's not necessarily exponential. It's not necessarily logistic. Boom and bust. And for independent work, if you want, assuming I get around to grading it, you could write a paper about this. Like, what are some other examples of boom and bust? Because almost every textbook I've ever read or taught out of, they always use this example of boom and bust. And as you can imagine, I've had a lot of different biology classes. Anyway, any questions about that slide? All right, if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch a little this little animation about population ecology. But this brings us to our third main bullet point. So we're making good time and finish these two main bullet points. Let's start this third one. Now we're talking about applications of population ecology. Now, when we first started this chapter, I did give you one slide where we talked about some applications of population ecology. We talked about why this is useful, like why do you care if it's not biology majors. Now we're going to dive into it a little bit deeper. And the next word for attendance, that one right there, I'll circle it. Instead of saying it. Same thing, if you're here live in person or live online, send the word within 5 minutes of the lecture being done. If you're watching the video, send that word, but use it in a sentence. Anyway, let's jump into it. Natural ecosystems have been converted to those that produce goods and services for our benefit, right? So, for example, think about the Midwest. Think about all the corn farms in Nebraska, right? That used to be a natural ecosystem. That used to be a bunch of grassland, right? With a bunch of different grasses, a bunch of different birds living in those grasses, and a bunch of different snakes eating those birds, and so on and so forth, right? It was a natural habitat, but then we changed it, and now it grows corn, right? This is one example. So because of that, we do use population ecology, right? We use population ecology to increase the populations of organisms we wish to harvest. So in that hypothetical example, we were trying to increase the population of corn, right? Now we're also trying to decrease the population of pests. So again, in that example, we want to get rid of any of the insects, or the birds, whatever it is that's eating the corn, right? We want to decrease that population. And also, another thing, completely off that discussion, but we can also use population ecology to save populations of organisms that are threatened with extinction. And this is usually the one that gets the most attention, I think, especially big animals. Everyone loves to talk about the rhinos and the giraffes or elephants. And it is sad, right? When you think about a species this threatened with extinction, it is sad. But if you have our 108 class, hopefully you would understand that the bigger picture is not just losing that one species, but what it will do to the entire ecosystem. And that's not a tree-hugging thing, but it sounds like it. Again, if you took the 108 class, you would understand, and you get a little bit of it in this class a little bit later. We need ecosystems to live, right? So if you lose individuals from the ecosystem, then you might lose the ecosystem. That's not good for us. Anyway, let's get into it. Applications of population ecology. First one we're going to talk about, which is the last bullet point I just showed you, is the conservation of endangered species. This is a really good example that your old textbook uses, so I'm glad I'm using this. I'm not going to ever ask you any examples or questions about examples. But I do love this example. Let's talk about it. So, there's this woodpecker that lives down south. It's very specific in where it can live, right? It requires long leaf pine forests because it likes to drill its holes in those pine trees, right? It's very specific. That's the only place it can live. It needs that type of forest. If you've ever driven down south, and I'm sure since this is West Virginia, again, you've driven to Myrtle Beach, so you've probably driven through a long leaf pine forest. But anyway, their numbers have been going down. Why? Well, some of this makes sense. Logging, right? So we need trees, we need lumber. You gotta cut down some trees for humans to live. So when you cut down the trees, you cut down their homes, therefore their population goes down. Makes sense, right? The other one makes sense too. Agriculture. So again, if you've driven to Myrtle Beach, I'm sure you've driven through all those cornfields. Again, that's a good example of agriculture. That used to be a forest. They cut down those trees so they can grow corn, so they can feed humans. But these two make sense. The part that's not very intuitive is this one right here. Suppressing fires has actually caused their populations to go down, right? And if you're not a population ecologist, if you're just a regular old person, you might think, and I would think before I learned about this, you might think, okay, these birds require these forests to survive. As those forests go away, and so do the birds. So if someone were to tell me, like, look, we've got to protect these forests, don't let them catch on fire, I'd be like, yes, that makes sense. Let's not let these forests catch on fire because they're home to this endangered species. So let's not let them catch on fire. But this isn't the case. Let's talk about why. Because for this species, the breeding birds abandon their nest when the vegetation is too thick and high around the tree. Right? So basically what I'm saying here is these birds, yes, they need those trees, they need to live in those forests, but once the undergrowth starts getting too thick, then they're just like, forget this. They abandon their nest, I guess sometimes with eggs in them, and that's part of what's causing their population to decline, right? Because vegetation is getting too thick. Why is the vegetation getting too thick? Because people have been putting out fires, right? It's completely counterintuitive. Again, you would think fires are bad for woods, right? Fires are bad for forests. These birds need the forest. Let's protect the forest. Let's protect the birds. But in this case, that was counterintuitive. I'll show you a picture of what I mean here. So this is what they look like when we protect them from fire. This is what it looks like when you get the fires, the occasional fires. Again, I know this is counterintuitive because you think fire is bad, but when you think about it, fires are natural occurrences. So in this case, this thing evolved to live in this habitat. Then humans got involved, probably thought they were doing the right thing. Like, oh, put out that fire, put out that fire. And that led to this. This led to a decline in their population. But the point here, and I love that the old textbook did this is why population ecology is so important. Because we have to have people who know this stuff. Because again, common sense would tell me, no, let's keep the fires out. Let's don't let the fires burn. That's what this endangered species live. So it's not always about common sense. It requires people to understand population ecology to be able to control stuff like this. Anyway, any questions about that? Again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about these woodpeckers. Another example, too, speaking of which, this is less about biology, but there's a lot of wildfires out in the West, right? Not so much this year, but I don't know if you guys remember the bad wildfires in California. Part of it is because of this, because we keep putting out fires. And therefore, the stuff that usually burns accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. So then when you do have a fire, it's a huge fire. It's hard to control. Anyway, there's no questions about that. Let's move forward and talk about sustainable resource management. So again, we're talking about why population ecology is important. So this is the second thing we're talking about, sustainable resource management. First of all, your book doesn't get into it too much, but let me tell you what sustainable means. I'm sure you know, but basically it's something that if it's sustainable, you can keep on doing, right? If we had a tree, if for some reason the 5 of us were locked in this room for 10 years, we're lucky for us as a tree that produces, 5 apples a day. If we ate 5 apples a day, we'd be okay, right? Because we'd get a new one. If for some reason we're starting to eat more than 5 apples a day, that would be unsustainable, right? So that's sustainability. We'll get into more of that later. Anyway, back to this. According to logistic growth, and there might be a test question on this, the fastest growth in a population occurs when you're about halfway to carrying capacity. So again, if you look at this horribly drawn graph of logistic growth, whatever the species may be that we're looking at here, there's carrying capacity right here, right? I draw a dotted line. That's carrying capacity. See, that's supposed to be 0. So whatever this is right here in the middle, that's the sweet spot. So if you're the person in DNR who's in charge of saying, all right, you can only catch this many trout, or you can only kill this many deer, right? What they're going for is this number right here, generally speaking, because if you hit that, when you hit the sweet spot, right, you're still anything more than this, right? If you collect any more than this, then what's going to happen is the population is going to decline, right? Because you're harvesting more than there's being put down. Now, if you collect any less than this, the population will decline, but obviously that's not going to help you because you're trying to collect trout or deer or whatever it is that you're getting, right? So that's the sweet spot. You need to know that for the exam. Possibly, I might ask it right now. Yes, that's the sweet spot. So again, if I were using real numbers here, this is the number of tuna in a certain spot of the Pacific, and the carrying capacity in whatever spot of the Pacific is 100,000. Whoever's in charge of how many tuna these boats can catch, what they're looking for is a quota of 50,000, right? This is half quota between 0 and carrying capacity, right? So they want the fisheries to catch 50,000 tuna a year, and that's it. Any questions about the sweet spot, so to speak? All right, your old textbook is another good example of this, so I'm going to talk about it. Fish, which are the only wild animal that are still hunted at a large scale. I know we don't usually think of it as hunting because we use a different word for it, fishing, but that is the same thing. It's hunting, it's just hunting in a different way. Anyway, fish are very vulnerable to overharvesting. So let's talk about this one example. It's a great example. The North Atlantic cod fishery. So what happened was they screwed it up, right? So again, someone's in charge of this. Someone was trying to hit that sweet spot. Like, all right, there's boats that go out there and catch these cods in the North Atlantic. There's businesses, or excuse me, the government says, all right, these boats, there's however many boats, so you can catch this many pounds or this many fish per trip, whatever the thing is, or per year, right? So what happened was they had estimated the population too high. So again, historical graph here. Let's say they thought this was the population, right? So that's the sweet spot, right? So they're saying, all right, this is how many you should catch. But their estimate was too high. So it could be population is actually like this, right? Therefore, well, that's obviously exaggerated as I wanted, but anyway, therefore, if you're catching that many, now you're really catching too many. You're not at the sweet spot, you're catching too many. Because, again, somebody miscalculated how many fish there were. And that goes back to something we talked about on Wednesday or Monday, right? We were talking about populations. I was talking about figuring out the population density, right? It's not feasible. Like, there's no way to go count every fish in the ocean. So, again, this is why this is so important, because you need to be able to do that accurately. Anyway, that's the big reason. That was the big problem. Was their estimates were wrong, so that led to over collecting fish. But also, a little bit less important, at least for the context of this conversation, there was also the practice of discarding young cod that were not legal sized at sea, and that actually caused a higher mortality rate than predicted because they thought they'd be okay when they weren't. Anyway, here's a graph of what it looked like, right? So for a while, numbers were great, right? It was a great booming business, sort of like coal in West Virginia. There was whole towns and whole areas in the New England who relied on this. And now, since 1992, it's just gone, right? They screwed it up, they crashed the population, and now a whole industry is gone. Again, imagine that in West Virginia, something couldn't happen in coal. But imagine if something happened and they were just like all of a sudden 1 year, oh, we're out. Well, what would you do? Because it's not just the fishermen, but the people who rely on it. So on and so forth. Anyway, back to this idea of what we're talking about here. Sustainable catch rates cannot be estimated without knowledge of life history traits. So all those things we talked about earlier, like at what age do they first are they first reproducing? How often do they reproduce? When they do reproduce, like how big is their brood in this case? Like how many little baby fishes are they making in this case? So all that stuff we talked about earlier, that comes in here, right? You need to know those things to be able to have the rules to say, all right, when you're going to catch cod, in this case, you need to do it from this month to this month. They need to be this big and not this big. And you can only catch this many, not that many, right? You need to know all this. So again, population, or not again, it's a new concept here. Population ecology alone, which is what we're learning about in this chapter, it is not sufficient enough to figure all this out. Right? Sustainable fisheries require knowledge of community and ecosystem characteristics. So this second bullet point is kind of like saying, hey, guess what? We're going to learn about this stuff in the next chapter. But for now, the point is, we do need to know population ecology, but also, what I'm saying here is there's also other stuff. So all the stuff I'm teaching you, we need to know it. We also need to add some stuff to it. Next word for attendance will be fish. Speaking of fish, if you download this PowerPoint, see if you click that, it's actually the link. If you click the fish, it'll show you a short little video where they talk about this whole situation that I just talked about with the North Atlantic cod industry collapsing. Any questions about this? All right, now for my favorite topic. My least favorite thing on Earth, but my favorite topic is at least it's interesting. Invasive species. All those little cats in your neighborhood. Those are invasive species along your doors. Anyway, organisms introduced to non-native habitats can have devastating effects on the ecosystem, which is why I have that little star. Sometimes they don't. For example, if you were to take your pet alligator, take it to Anchorage, Alaska, put it in the stream and say, be free. That's not going to have a devastating effect on the ecosystem. It's probably just going to die right away, right? The alligators were not meant to be in frozen areas. That's just one example. So then, again, not everything that goes somewhere that it isn't supposed to be is an invasive species. So let's talk about what makes an invasive species an invasive species. It is a non-native species that has spread far beyond the original point of introduction, like cats, for example, or stink bugs, or these things right here, Asian carps. If you click any three of these pictures, see those little short videos. Hey, no, just the one on the right. There's videos that you can see these things in action. It's actually quite interesting, I think. Obviously, it's really bad. They've been introduced. They're overwhelming our lakes or rivers. And this is kind of funny. It's actually more devastating than this. Like, people are getting their noses broken because they're going down the river, and what happens is they're calm. But when boats start going down the river, they get too excited and they start jumping up out of the water. And literally, people, like I said, they broke their nose, they jump out and get hit. Going back to the idea of biology, this is actually a little bit more important than that because they are killing all the native wildlife. It's destroying the ecosystem, and basically everything's dying in these rivers because of those carps. I'm not going to ask any specific questions about those carps, just like that. All right, these numbers are from your old textbook. I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of these numbers. These numbers also are a little old, so they might be a little bit different now. But just to talk about why invasive species, why this concept is important. In the United States, there's hundreds of invasive species. That includes plants, mammals, fish, arthropods, like mussels, things like that. Bolus mussels. Anyway, point is, in the U.S. we have a bunch of them. And again, this isn't just some tree hugging thing, like the fact that I don't like outdoor cats. It's not because, well, part of this, because they do kill native wildlife, but also for the non-tree huggers, to the people who only care about money, invasive species cost $137 billion a year in the United States. That's a lot of money. So even if you're not tree hugging, don't care about all the little native birds or whatever, if you're just all about the money, well, invasive species are costing us a bunch of money, $137 billion a year. And that was back in 2016, so I bet that number's larger right now. Like I've already pointed out earlier, not every non-native species is invasive. If you can't survive there, it's not going to become invasive. And there's no single explanation why some non-native species turn into damaging pests, but invasive species typically exhibit opportunistic life history patterns. There's some really good examples. I wish we had more time to talk about it, or that you can write papers about it for different work. I went to a place called Guam and thought it looked like a tropical paradise. Eventually, I noticed there was no birds. This is way before I'm a biologist. Like, what in the world? Where are all the birds? And then later, I found out when I started studying biology, the reason there's no birds on Guam is because back in World War II, snakes would hitch a ride on the planes, flying from island to island in World War II. The snakes would hitch a ride from the plane to one island, and then they got to Guam. There's all these birds, and there was no snakes on Guam until World War II. And then they snuck in that way, snakes on the plane. But anyway, those snakes then killed all the birds on the island because none of those birds had ever seen snakes. They were not evolved to deal with snakes. And another interesting thing about that, not that I'm attention on, I just think it's interesting. Now Guam is trying to get rid of the snake population. They're doing all kinds of interesting things. One of the things they're doing is they take dead mice, they lace them with a really high dose of Tylenol, acetaminophen, and then they parachute those little dead mice out of the plane. Like they drop them out and they'll parachute down to the ground, and then the snakes eat them, and it poisons them. It destroys their liver because it's too much Tylenol. So it's just an interesting story when you think about it. Like snakes on a plane, dead parachuting mice trying to kill snakes by overdose of Tylenol. Anyway, let's get to an actual example from the old textbook. Cheatgrass, and I love this as a really good example. Cheatgrass looks like grass. How many of you have driven past a field of grass? It just looks like a field of grass, right? I see it all the time every time I go. I'm a biologist, and I still can't say like, oh, that's native, that's not native, right? To me, it just looks like a field of grass. This is why I think this is an interesting example. Anyway, this cheatgrass is an invasive plant of the arid western United States. That's not where it's from, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be invasive, but that's where it is invading. It covers millions of acres that were formerly dominated by native grasses and sagebrush. Right, so again, in my mind, if I were to go out to some place that's being overrun by cheatgrass, I wouldn't know it, right? Unless someone pointed it out to me and said, this is what cheatgrass looks like, and this is what the native plants look like, I wouldn't know it. I would see a big field of green and think, that looks good, that's healthy, right? That's good for nature. Green is good, plants are good, but not always. So, really quickly, how are they invasive? Well, basically they're outcompeting the native grasses. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways they do that is they produce seeds earlier and in greater abundance, right? So there's the cheatgrass, and there's all the other grasses. And the cheatgrass is before any of the other grasses are put down the seeds. The cheatgrass is like, all right, here's a bunch of seeds, right? So obviously they're winning that way. Another problem is that they mature in the early summer. And when that happens, think about early summer, right? Really hot. And like I said, this is the arid, this is the dry part of the western United States. So then it becomes extremely dry and flammable, and that creates abundant fuel that's easily ignited by lightning, right? So what happens is, again, because of the way it is, it's not evolved to be there. It dies quicker, there's more of it. It's a source of fuel for fires. Because of that, these cheatgrass fires are more intense and more frequent than fires that native plants are evolved to tolerate. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with woodpeckers. In that case, I was like, we need fire. Fire is good. It's a natural thing. And fire is a natural thing, even in this case. The fire is a natural thing. However, due to the cheatgrass and the nature of its the plant itself, right, the fires are too intense, right? So all the grasses that are there are evolved to be burned, right? They're evolved to take advantage of that situation. But because of the cheatgrass, those fires are too intense and it's just killing them. So after a few fire cycles, pretty much all the native plants were gone. And here, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. If you were to ask me, you're a biologist, and show me a picture of cheatgrass, I'd be like, that looks nice, it's green, that looks healthy, that's a good thing. But it's not, right? And it's hard to tell unless you understand population ecology. Because, and again, it's not just, oh, who cares? You're a tree hugger, who cares if you have one grass versus the other? Well, as their old textbook points out, there's about 150 species of birds and mammals that are now without food and shelter. So again, to us, grass is grass. But if you're a small bird or a small mammal that requires the specific native grasses to eat, to hide in, right? And you can't do it with this invasive cheatgrass, then they're gone, right? You've lost your food, you've lost your shelter. So again, it's not just, oh, big deal, we lost the native grasses, but we also lost the whole ecosystem that depended on those native grasses. That's a big theme here that I don't get to talk about enough, right? When we're talking about any kind of environmental thing, It's not just the one species that you're worried about. When you lose one species, it affects other species. Anyway, your book, or your old textbook also points out that climate change has hastened this transition of rangeland to fields of cheatgrass. Why? Not that I'm going to ask you this, but cheatgrass responds better to CO2. So as the increased levels of CO2, or as the CO2 levels increase in the atmosphere, cheatgrass is taking advantage of it, so it's getting even bigger. It's growing even faster. It's having more intense fires, so the problem is getting exacerbated. The last word for attendance, grass. We'll finish right on time. All right. See you guys on Monday, unless you visit me for office hours. Have a great weekend.